Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Cultivating Success webinar. Today's webinar is on Idaho irrigation water rights and access. Cultivating Success is a small acreage farming and ranching program and WSU's food systems program. Our presenter today is Karie Boone. Dr. Karie Boone is located in Payette County, which is in southwest Idaho, and she is an extension educator with an appointment in small farms and food systems. I'm Colette D. Phelps. I'm your moderator today. I'm an area educator located in northern Idaho on the University of Idaho Moscow campus. As we get started with today's webinars, I wanted just to go over a couple webinar tips. If you close all of the other programs that are running on your computer, you can dedicate your internet bandwidth to this webinar. If you are having any problems with your sound, you can call in at any time on the phone number provided in your welcome email. If you do that, you'll want to mute your computer so that you don't get feedback. If you're having any difficulties at all, please feel free to type something into the Q&A box, and I will do my best to help you solve any technical issues. At any time, you can type questions into the question and answer box for Karie. I will either ask her those questions during the webinar on your behalf, or I will save them till the end when we have a Q&A session, just depending on the content and the timing. I did email out to everyone a handout of today's webinar slides, so you don't need to actually write down all of those details. You have that in your email inbox. We will also have that handout and a webinar recording available through the Cultivating Success website, and I will show you how to find that at the end of the webinar. With that, we wanted to do a quick poll and to see where folks are located today. So if you haven't done a poll, it's just like a little survey question, and you can go ahead and type in where you are located. So right now, the folks on the webinar are located in both southwest Idaho and north Idaho. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn today's webinar over to our speaker, Karie. And so to do that, I need to stop sharing my screen and allow her to share hers.
Thanks, Colette. Let me make the switch here. And, oh, 1 second here. I know we just did this, and now let's see, share, that one, share, and play from current slide. Okay, can you all see my screen okay?
We can hear you as well.
Great. All right. So thanks for joining us today. I'm glad to see there's people from Southwest Idaho on the webinar today, because that's where I'm located and where I have a lot of experience working with irrigation. This is also relevant for the rest of Idaho as well. I have a special place in my heart for Southwest Idaho. So for today's webinar, we're going to be learning really the basics of water access for small acreage irrigation, in hopes of really trying to avoid water-related legal and social conflicts, which happen way more often than I'd like. And then also looking at the different types of irrigation organizations as really the foundation of access to water for your small acreage. And then, of course, through Cultivating Success, we generally want to encourage participating in responsible and sustainable resource-based development in our regions. And so this is all a part of that. And to get us there, I'm going to give us a little background on how irrigation districts were formed And some of the first pioneer irrigators and how they got going with production in the area. I'll go into a little more depth on what are irrigation districts and how they function. Also, for those interested in groundwater, we'll talk a little bit about how to get wells going, and give you a background on what is a water right and why is it important, and just various types of different water access organizations. And then we'll tie it up with just bringing it back to you and your property, and what does this all mean for you and irrigating, on a small acreage. So just to start, it wasn't really that long ago that irrigation water was really the primary water use in Idaho. And so miners and their families and the towns that were built around mining needed to eat. And so water for agriculture became highly important. And there was absolutely no irrigation setup. It's not just something they showed up and it was here. They had to build it all themselves. And so these were a lot of economically poor people that labored to really make our regions farmable. And so I have a really great appreciation for them. And irrigation water in particular is unique because it really the people in the community really relied on each other. So it was really a neighbors helping neighbors is really necessary. No one could do it alone. This was a huge feat for anyone back in that time. So water has really shaped the land and the way people organize themselves in a community, because they weren't able to really settle anywhere and grow food unless there's irrigation set up. And so wherever they were able to do this, people came together to organize institutions to build and operate and maintain irrigation. And this, again, was, this was starting from scratch. So you can see in that picture I just popped up, they're dragging loads of soil up onto this ramp, dumping it into wagons, and the soil is being transported away to other areas that might need it. They used horses and a buck scraper to plow a new irrigation ditch in the hillside. Most of the heavy work was done by horses and scrapers, and then the men with hand shovels did all the finishing work. And so this was really just a massive infrastructure feat, engineering feat for the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and really could not have been done without the entire community working together. And then, so over time, they didn't start with irrigation districts and, all the sort of management and administrative support of irrigation districts, only with a shift to higher value crops like sugar beets or potatoes, where irrigation districts formed to then finance and manage the canal system that these pioneers had built. And so we can appreciate the pioneers and the irrigation organizations for our ability to grow food in Idaho, and sort of their historic significance, because we're still using a lot of those same irrigation and lateral ditches today. And so this is a little bit more of what we're looking at. This is mostly down in southern Idaho, both in the east and the west. You can see up in the right-hand corner, a ditch rider's cleaning out some debris and such, which is an ongoing project. I guess we don't really have many people. Well, we do have a few people from Northern. This is up near Coeur d'Alene. And just want to give you a minute to look at this. You don't need to get in too much detail, but you can see the yellow arrow there. That's the management area for an irrigation district, and just sort of interesting to take a look at the landscape overall and you can see the stream just north of Coeur d'Alene, over to Post Falls, and that blue management area. And it's just kind of interesting to look at how these irrigation districts are kind of set on the landscape and all the laterals and whatnot that go to all those different plots out there to allow farming to happen. And then here's another one. And again, don't get bogged down in the details here. This was southern Idaho, southwest, so Canyon County. You can see on the left picture, there's Lake Lowell if you want to sort of situate yourself, and just north of that is Caldwell. And this just gives us an idea of how prolific these irrigation districts are. And once, you'll have the copy of this presentation, and you can, if you're happen to be in this area, you can look and see whose service area you're in. And for those of you that aren't necessarily in Canyon County, most counties do have maps like this on their county websites. They're not always easy to find. I had to dig around for this, but they are there. I believe I have the link to this on the resources page at the end. But this is important because the different districts and irrigation companies can only deliver within their boundaries. So you need to make sure you're talking to the correct irrigation district for where you live. And you can usually look at these maps and locate your house and figure out who you're supposed to be talking to. And so a little bit more in general about irrigation companies, irrigation districts, which those are two. They manage their water differently. And then canal companies as well. So they're the ones that own water rights and distribute the water. They own the diversion facilities and the infrastructure, and they're responsible for maintaining them. And they're governed by a set of bylaws, and they have a board of directors, and they're all elected. And again, these are really historic institutions. I highly recommend, if you haven't gone to any of their meetings, if you're a member of the district or the company, to go to the meetings and just meet people. You can ask questions, just get to know the people on the board. There tend to be well-known people in the community, people you probably want to know anyway, especially if you're new in the area. So that picture on the right, that's Black Canyon Irrigation District. That's their picture. That's up at Black Canyon Reservoir just outside of Emmett. And so it's a huge reservoir, and that supplies water all down in to so many different areas in the valley. So it's a huge project there. So that's how we make sure we get our water when we need it in irrigation season. Is it's blocked up in the dam, and then they release it as needed there. So a little bit more. So the companies or the districts will divert water from the river or stream and deliver it to your lateral system. And so I should say, just as a preface for this, it's really difficult to generalize across regions in Idaho. It is really region and district and company specific how they go about distributing the water. I think these main points here are pretty generalizable, but in terms of how much water you're allotted, how many shares you're allowed to buy, if there are shares, how they maintain, all that stuff is really specific to the irrigation company or the irrigation district or canal company. And so that's really important, and why it's really important that you work with your particular irrigation district and your neighbors to understand the irrigation norms and practices of your area. So just wanted to preface with that. So just moving on, so they are responsible for the development and maintenance of canals and ditches. They, however, do not generally go beyond the delivery point. So if you're getting water at a headgate, beyond that headgate, they don't step on that. They are not responsible for maintaining your lateral system. The lateral is the sort of smaller ditch that comes off the bigger one. It's the one that's past your delivery point or past your headgate. And that is really your responsibility. We'll talk a little bit more about lateral associations here in a minute. And so if you do belong to an irrigation district or a company, there's a few things, just background that you should know. Their water is generally delivered by or measured by acre feet. And so total acre feet of water granted to every paid, a specific amount, depending on the irrigation company or district, of water is granted to every paid irrigatable acre. And it's usually set out at the beginning of the year. They make projection, the company will make a projection based on how much storage water there is in those dams. And so the next one, the green one, is what I thought the first one was, is the acre feet. And so if you're not familiar with acre feet, that's oftentimes how water is measured by your irrigation company or district. And so if you think about 1 acre foot would cover 1 acre of ground 12 inches deep. And so you can think about that in terms of the field you're trying to water and your irrigation scheduling. And so typically, and I say typically because again, it depends, the water year is April to mid-October of each year. So it does depend, but water gets turned on based on the weather and turned off based on storage levels. So this is really important for irrigators to know, because if it is a short water year, you may get your water shut off earlier than you want, and you may be stuck with a field of corn and not have any water to finish it off. And so that light blue tab at the bottom, this is a link that you can check your reservoir levels so you can get a good idea if you're going to have a short year or not. And then you can, you know, depending on the projections at the beginning of the year, you can decide what you're going to plant based on that. So you might want to plant something that's going to harvest earlier if it's a dry year, and if it's not, then you have a little bit more flexibility. And so this is straight off that link on the last slide. These are some of the reservoirs that feed Southwest Idaho. So they monitor the reservoir levels. And I know some farmers that are just on this like 3 times a day when it's getting close to planting season. And you can see at the very top, again, the details, don't get too bogged down in the details here. At the very top, Cascade, you can see Cascade Reservoir is pretty full right now. And we haven't even gotten to spring runoff, so we're looking pretty good. And if you're down at the bottom right, Anderson Ranch, if you depend on that, you're looking good. So this area is looking on the right track for having a pretty good water year. And so you can always you can search different regions of Idaho on the Bureau of Reclamation website, that link I gave you. And so I noticed there's not a lot of reservoirs up in the northern panhandle. So this may not be quite as relevant to you guys. Going back to the headgate, this is an important point. As I mentioned, this is where your water is allocated at. The gate is open and closed by a ditch rider, and I'll talk a little bit about ditch riders in a moment. You can call in an order for water to your irrigation organization, and based on your shares or your water rights. And the ditch rider is the person who adjusts the gate for you, opens it, measures it. And again, in times of plenty, you may be able to adjust your own head gate, not a big deal. Also depends on the organization you're working with, how much they really have to count the water. But in times of scarcity, there may be a padlock on the gate so that you're not taking someone else's water. And so the ditch rider is really the person that keeps track of how much you're taking and for how many days. I just want to take a minute with ditch riders. So these guys, if you're ever gonna bake cookies for anybody, this is the one. The ditch riders really, they really make sure water is delivered to everyone on the ditch in a way that is, you know, they take their jobs very seriously. They are delivering water to high production agriculture, small acreage agriculture. And if you can think of peoples whose livelihoods depend on water to grow onions, for example, as we have a lot down here. You know, they realize that water is life for these people, and they have to get them their water, and that's their job. And it's a difficult one, because there's, if you can imagine, there's 50 small farms and 25 large farms on a canal, and you have to measure out each one out and know who asked for what, keep the ditches clean, flowing, manage any conflicts between neighbors or whatnot, answer people running out to you with questions. And they're also basically a water accountant. You know, they have their book and they're keeping track of everything. And so they really make sure people are getting their water, and they play an extremely important role, and you really just want to be on their good side. There's a picture there, that top one, that's down in Minidoka County. So that's them just cleaning out some dredge there. And then on the bottom right, and I just really like these historic pictures. Ditch riders did used to ride around on horses, making sure people weren't taking more water than they were allocated. So let's see, does that have a date? Yeah, 1947. So yeah, kind of interesting. And just, they're not, you know, ditch riders are just people you want to have a relationship with, and make sure they are, you know, on your side one way or another. So that was all about surface water for the most part. And I know there's a lot of groundwater users as well. And so I just want to talk about that for a minute. Just with surface water, all groundwater, you do need water rights to access the groundwater. All water in the state is property of the state, and you can only acquire use of that water through an appropriation, a legal process. And so that would be the Idaho Department of Water Resources. You would go to them to get a drilling permit. The applications typically take 3 to 4 months. If you're just doing a domestic well, which would be a lower volume, if you're looking just to water lower acreage, a lower quantity of acreage, you can do this. You do have to get a permit, but you don't need an actual right. And you can irrigate up to a ½ acre of land, not exceeding 13,000 gallons per day. And so that's an option for people who, you know, don't have a lot of land to irrigate. Let's see. So, and just so you can get an idea of the different aquifers in Idaho. And I just want to throw this up here because, well, I love the maps, and just so you can get an idea what aquifer you're on, and you can then go and learn a little bit about that aquifer. You can learn if it's in particular, well, let me tell you a little bit about how the groundwater and surface water interaction works, because this is important, and this is why water rights can be so complicated. And so interaction happens between rivers and groundwater on basically 3 different basic ways. So the streams, like let's see if you can see my arrow here, the stream over here on the right, it can gain water from inflow of groundwater through the stream bed. And it can also lose water to groundwater by outflow. And so, you know, that's outflow through the stream bed. And so that's why water rights can be so complicated sometimes, is, you know, there's this groundwater surface water interaction, and the water rights have to account for that. So for example, in summer, your well level may decrease because everyone's irrigating off the stream. And so you need to make sure your intake is at the appropriate depth for that, so you don't get cut off there. And the other piece about this is the groundwater management areas. I know there's a few up in central and north Idaho. The groundwater management areas, they have very specific rules and regulations for using that water. And you just want to make sure you know how that works. And again, you can check with your Idaho Department of Water Resources, should have that all mapped out. And so speaking of Idaho Department of Water Resources, just stepping back, there's the state administered accounting system for water use for both streams and groundwater. And I just want to talk a little bit about that. On paper, I'm going to go through what it looks like on paper, and just keeping in mind that in practice, it's actually a lot more messy. But these are legal documents if you have a water right. So to better understand how it gets so messy, let's look at the underlying legal aspects of water rights in Idaho. So that is a water right. And that's the first page. It doesn't give you the quantities or anything. But basically, a water right is the right to divert public waters and put them to a beneficial use in accordance with one's priority date. And I'll talk about what those mean. All waters in Idaho are public waters, but they are administered by the state. And the water rights system in Idaho and in the West in general runs on a first in time, first in right. So the first person in the area to have a water right, they're going to have the oldest water right, and they will have seniority over people that come later on. Now, depending on the practices and norms of your property's irrigation organization, you're going to interact differently with water rights. So in a lot of cases, the water right is held in trust by your irrigation district, and is for use on the lands for which the water is designated, and is only for irrigation. And so you can only use water in a very prescribed manner. So if you have irrigation water, you can't actually use that for municipal or industrial uses. It has to be used for irrigation. It says so on the right. And so I mentioned like priority date and first in time, first in right. And so just every water right that either you hold or that your irrigation district holds has a priority date. So that gives it its seniority over the people that came later, a quantity of how much can be used during irrigation season, a purpose of use. So that's going to be the beneficial use. That's going to be the irrigation, municipal, industrial, environmental uses. And then it has a very particular point of diversion. So if you have a diversion point on your that comes into your lateral, you can't just move that where you want without going through a legal process. And then place of use, your acreage, and then a season of use. And so all that is defined in the water rights that either you or your company holds. So the Idaho Department of Water Resources has a database of both groundwater and surface water rights. They actually have a really cool map. I didn't have enough slides to put on here, where you can actually click on the different water rights and see where yours is, and it comes up with all the information about each water right from a map, and that's really useful. And so when you think about establishing your right, you want to make sure that the question is there water right already associated with the land? So was there water used on your property before you acquired it? And did the previous owner reserve the water right in the deed conveying the property to you? And that's really important, because you want to know if there isn't water, you want to know why there isn't water. And so that's when you can check on this database. And if you decide you want to establish a new water right, there are forms and procedures on the IDWR. I'd talk with somebody at your local office before doing that. So each region, the west, east, south, north, each region has their own IDWR administration office. And so if you're thinking about applying for a new water right, a change of use, etc., you want to go ahead and contact your region's administrator. They're really nice and helpful. And I do have a link at the end of this presentation to that contact information. And so for those of you who are on an irrigation district or company, and you have a water share that was deeded with your property, this is a little bit different than an actual water right. So you're basically, again, the district company holds a water right, and then you as a member of that district own a share in that company. And so here I just preface again that it really depends how much that share is depending on your organization. The standard is 1 share is 1 acre foot of water, varies greatly. So you have to talk to each company about that. So you are the private entity that is paying for water shares to be diverted from the canal. And you, every member in the irrigation organization, the shareholders pay assessments once or twice a year, depending, for the maintenance of the conveyance infrastructure and other related expenses.
We have a question about this.
Yes.
So is acre feet allocation on a weekly basis? The question says, is acre feet allocation on a weekly basis? Or maybe I'm thinking of miner's inches, as I think that's what's specified on my irrigation bill.
Yes. So I wish I had, I have asked that question before. And what I'm told by the irrigation companies is it depends on the particular company. And so you need to go talk with them and they will explain that to you. It really depends on the district and the company.
It seems to me that when I listen to you talk about water, every site has its own situational circumstances that you really have to delve into your site very specifically and make sure you understand everything about it.
Yes, and I've really tried, I've talked to different irrigation companies and districts across the state to try and come up with like a generalizable content, and it's just absolutely impossible. They're too different. They're, again, they were developed in their localized regions. And the board of directors kind of, makes the decisions on those types of questions, and it really varies. Yeah, and so it's like almost too complicated a little bit, because behind all of those, how many days can I irrigate and such, there are different rules, regulations, statutes, laws, and such behind that. And so that's why we can't just give a generalized response for those. And I really wish I could. Maybe someday I'll be familiar enough with all the different irrigation organizations in the region that I could be like, oh, which one? Let me tell you. But that's going to take a while. So sorry, I can't be more specific on that.
Absolutely. So from your perspective as an educator working with small farms, what do you think some of the considerations people might want to kind of play out scenarios in their mind when they learn about what water access they have and how they would use that information in planning out their production system?
Yeah, so once you figure out the quantity of water you have shares to, obviously you're going to put that into your irrigation scheduling, and which crops you're able to grow. If you have based on the amount of space you want to cultivate, and the type of crop, that's all going to be dependent on the amount of water you have access to. And so I think it's really important to plan that all out before you decide what you want to plant and where. I guess I say where because that comes up quite often. Your property could be right on the Snake River, but you don't have rights to that river. Your delivery point off the ditch is like on the other side of your neighbor's property. And so that's another important piece I don't hit on this presentation, is figuring out how do you get your water to your property, because it can end up being more complicated than you would think.
Those are great things to consider. So in our neighboring states, such as Washington, there are different rules about water, and there's different rules for water use depending on whether it's used for crops or livestock. In Idaho, do we have the same water availability regardless of the production system, or are there some differences if you are providing water to livestock versus using it for crops?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly. I would have to check, because I know with some districts they don't discriminate, because again they hold the water right in trust, and they don't often have to get that detailed. They just know it's for agriculture. But in other cases, I wouldn't know. It depends on how much, what their water right says, and if they're a district or a company. Companies have a lot more flexibility, and they often don't have to be as sort of stringent on the rules, just the way their water rights are set up. And then the districts have a whole different setup. So I don't have a straight answer for that either.
Okay, another point of investigation.
Yeah.
I just have one final question, Karie, and that's, what would your recommendations be regarding testing your sources of water and then identifying appropriate use?
Testing in terms of like pesticide levels and such?
Yes, like, for instance, if you have water coming out of an irrigation canal, the different points of testing for water quality and how you might consider what some of those factors are, because dependent even on your groundwater or your surface water, there's going to be differences in water quality, whether that's from runoff or from leaching, and the potential to have like water that maybe that's not potable water for your animals, and then you have to look at another source.
Yeah. And where you are in the ditch as well. If you're getting the backwash from your neighbor, you want to look at what they're doing with it as well. So that, yeah. So you can go to the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality website, and they have the whole process for doing that testing. And we have several labs around the state that you can send in your water. We just did one, I think it was for a few different tests, it was around $40. And so they just, they charge you, they send you an invoice, and you can get the levels, and then talk with one of the managers there about how to interpret that as well.
Well, great. Thank you for that really informative presentation and asking all those questions. And if you stop sharing on your screen, I will show our participants where they can find further resources.
Oh, I have a few more slides.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, that's okay. And I think I have a little more time, maybe.
You do have more time. I thought this was our last question slide, so sorry
No,
about that.
There's
okay.
More. Well, yeah. I think that was in there from last time, that question slide. Sorry about that. I have just, I have about 1, 2, 3, about 10 more slides.
Excellent. We have plenty of time.
Okay. All right. So, great questions. And so I just want to try and clarify a little bit. I've mentioned irrigation districts, lateral districts, Idaho Department of Water. Just kind of give us the picture, the big picture of all these entities. The top yellow arrow, the lateral ditches, I'll give you a little more detail on. We haven't talked about them in depth yet. There's the drainage districts, which are prevalent in some areas and not others, and sometimes they're managed by an irrigation district. I'll talk about those. We talked about irrigation districts and companies and the importance of ditch riders. And then we also, the State Department of Water Resources and their role in administrating the water. And so this is these are the entities that you would interact with as you manage your water and irrigate on your property. It's this cadre of organizations and institutions, and that's for both ground and surface waters. Well, the Department of Water Resources would be the groundwater, and the rest would be surface water. So the Lateral Association. So the water comes down the ditch rider opens your head gate, and the water flows into your lateral. These are the smaller ditch systems, and this is where the irrigation districts or companies, their role basically stops. They won't touch for the most part, won't touch anything past the head gate. That's your responsibility. And in most cases, there is some sort of lateral association. You might have, if you got deeded water shares or water rights with your property, you might have also on that a legal document that describes your role in the Lateral Association. So it can be a very formal entity, because you are responsible for maintaining those laterals. And it happens with your neighbors for the most part, whoever's on that same lateral. Sometimes they'll meet once a month. You basically come up with your own, the association comes up with their rules and regulations on that. They can have bylaws and rules of cooperation, and oftentimes they can also be, if they're run well, they can be the basis for a sense of community among neighbors in rural areas, because you're having to cooperate. Of course, there can be issues, and that can cause erosion and weeds not being taken care of. Can cause some strife, but hopefully, if you're doing your part and participating as the bylaws state, then you'll be on good terms with your neighbors, which is what you want. And in other cases, there are not formal entities, and it can be kind of a mess. I just talked with someone a few days ago where their neighbor doesn't really live there. There's always a bunch of debris creating a pond during irrigation system that runs into their property. And so that's where you would want to talk with your other neighbors and figure out how you're going to manage that person. What do the bylaws say? Do you have bylaws? Or if it's an informal situation, you can try and come up. You can talk to your district, see if they have any ideas. But I think at that level, at the lateral level, it's mostly you and your neighbors there. The drainage district, back when they started irrigating in this region, they started having all this excess swampy area at the base of fields. And so they came up with districts to remove this excess irrigation water and get it out of the way. And so that, again, these can also be legally established public entities that have been organized and again have their bylaws, and they do the maintenance of these drainage ditches. So you can see if you're also a part of that. So tying it into your property. So if you haven't bought property, you're thinking about buying property, that is the time to really look at where's your water coming from. Again, IDWR maintains a database of both driller logs that have water levels recorded for the different well maintenance and when a well is drilled, and they have the different water rights identified there. And so make sure to look that up and figure out where your water comes from, who is your irrigation district and company. Check to see what you were deeded in terms of shares or water rights with your property, or excuse me, would you be deeded? I guess if this is still before you buy the property. I have worked with people who bought property 30 acres plus and there's no water on it. And that is not the situation you want to be in. In those cases, you can try and drill drill wells, which can be upwards of $30,000 or $40,000 to drill. And so it's super important to make sure you have some water source if you're looking to produce something on your land. And again, knowing your irrigation district or company, how they manage water payments and water delivery. People in the offices are extremely knowledgeable, and so they can fill you in on that. So making sure that you're in great communication with them, and remembering that they do not touch the lateral system. And in fact, they legally cannot touch anything past the delivery point of your lateral and so, to your lateral. So, and one thing to consider, especially I know down in southern Idaho, a lot of larger farms have been chopped up into smaller, 5 acres, 8 acres, 8-acre plots. And so the water is considered interrupted. And so you need to figure out, how you're gonna, oh, I need to sneeze. Excuse me. So if there's now 5 plots where there used to be 1, the way the irrigation infrastructure is set up is going to have to be basically redone. And so you're going to want to look at that. That's another cost you consider before buying your property. You might have to install a new headgate, dig a new well, figure out some sort of the ad hoc system that a neighbor has contrived and link up with that same lateral. And so all things to consider. And another reminder that even when you've done your homework, you understand the system, you set up your infrastructure, there are years where it is a dry year, and on those bad years, your headgate may be locked, and you may not have access as early as mid-July. And again, this really can impact your, what you grow and what you raise on your property. And so if you do have a land without water, first thing you want to do is find out why there is no water with their land. There may be a very important either legal or other reason that there's no water. And remember that you can't apply to dig an irrigation well with what IDWR. That's a domestic well, and it does allow you to irrigate at least a ½ acre near that well. I get that. And I think I've emphasized this throughout, and I just want to end on this, that these different districts and companies are set up as neighbors helping neighbors. That's how it started in the beginning with the pioneers. And there have been difficult times and water conflicts happening, especially down in the south here in the Treasure Valley, where there's a lot of competing demands now and more people moving into the area. And so that does inherently increase the opportunities for conflict, unfortunately. And so I think these different entities and organizations are really important to maintain and continue to make them a collaborative venture. So I have my little diagram there on the right, as if you are new to an area, for example, and you don't know your neighbors, just go over and knock on the door and introduce yourself and be neighborly. Don't start off asking them where your water is or, the heavy topics, and then go back later a few times after, hanging out or whatnot, and then ask for more information about the water and again, with your irrigation district. So here are some resources that will be in the PDF that Colette sent out to you all. And that is all I've got, Colette.
Okay, great. Now we have another question.
Okay.
Great. So this question is from North Idaho. So what do you do if you were told you had surface water on a creek and you get the transfer of rights done and you discover it was groundwater.
Like someone told you, or IDWR told you that you had? There'd be a lot of back and forth on this, and again, the best on these legal matters, it sounds like this would be a legal matter, so that would be IDWR contacting your local administrator in the northern districts.
Okay, she says, okay, thank you. Let's see if we have any other last minute questions that come up. So we don't have any open questions, so we can go ahead and do our wrap-up slides.
Okay, I'll stop my sharing here.
Okay. And
did that work for you?
Yep, that worked. So here we are. Okay, so just a reminder that you can register for upcoming webinars through the Cultivating Success website. You can also access webinar recordings through the website. So if you wanted to catch some of these things again, you could go up to programs at the top here. There's a drop-down menu, and you can click on recorded webinars and go to that page. We have some upcoming webinars in 2 weeks. So on Monday, February 24th is going to be a webinar about capturing consumer demand for local food, looking at some of the trends and messaging around those trends. Then Tuesday, February 25th, we're going to have an introduction and at the options using the program Quicken versus QuickBooks. I also wanted to let you know that in March, we are having a 4-part financial fitness for farmers class where you can take the webinars individually or as a series with exercises and support to really understand some of the key financial documents related to farm management. We do have a post-webinar survey. It's our evaluation. It takes about 3 minutes to complete. We would really appreciate your taking the time to do that. You can find the link in the handout I sent out. Also, this should actually generate right in your browser when I close the webinar. So with that, I really want to thank you, Karie, for that presentation and providing all of those resources for our webinar participants and those that watch the webinar recording. We look forward to interacting with you on another webinar in the future.